There are moments in life that leave deep scars. Sometimes it's the happiest moments that change us. Other times it's the darkest. I never imagined that such a disturbing revelation would change the course of my life, much less that everything I knew about my family, about my history, was based on a lie. I grew up as an only child. My parents were always very loving towards me, although I felt that there was something strange about our family, something that was never said but that was always in the air. My mother, although always warm, seemed to have a shadow in her eyes, a shadow she couldn't shake, as if a deep pain had been haunting her for years. My father was more distant, preoccupied with work, but always attentive to my needs. I don't have any particularly bad memories of my childhood, but I always felt that something was missing, something I couldn't name, but it was there. When I turned 30, life surprised me with something that even in my darkest nightmares I could never have imagined. It all started on a day like any other when I decided to accompany my mother to the doctor. She had been feeling unwell for the last few weeks, and although she insisted it was nothing serious, I knew something was wrong. She wasn't the type of person to complain about little things, so my concern had been growing little by little. The doctor greeted us with a serious expression, different from previous visits. My mother, although nervous, tried to appear calm. While he reviewed her results, I sat in a chair waiting. That's when the doctor looked at me with a look I couldn't interpret. After a couple of seconds, he turned to my mother. It was routine news, or so I thought at first. But her face paled as she listened. It wasn't the news about her health that seemed to affect her so much, but something in the conversation that quickly turned into a whisper. I decided it must be something important and followed her into the hallway, where my mother, her voice breaking, confessed that there was something she had to tell me. She had hidden something from me my entire life, something so profound that, according to her, she and my father had kept it a secret for decades. It was then that she revealed to me that on the day I was born, in the hospital where I was born, a terrible incident had occurred. She told me that when I was born, my twin brother had disappeared. She had given birth to 2 boys, but only one was placed in her arms, the other simply disappeared. They didn't know what happened. The news was hushed up, a shadow quickly hidden under a cloak of oblivion. My mother, of course, was devastated. I remember her telling me that the hospital administration tried to explain the mistake, but they never did so clearly. No one was ever able to explain how or why it had happened, and it was all let go, buried under layers of time and bureaucracy. The tragedy was so great that my parents were never able to talk about it, at least not with me. My mother never spoke to me about it until that day after so many years, and she still did so with the same pain in her eyes that I had seen on her face when I was a child. She had lost her son, and no one had ever found him. For days I couldn't stop thinking about it. Everything I had believed about my family, about myself, crumbled before me. The idea of having had a brother, of someone of my own blood being torn away from me, from her, consumed me. It was as if everything I knew about my life was a lie. The truth was so shocking that I found it difficult to process. But what disturbed me most was the lack of answers. What had happened to him? How had he disappeared? Why had no one told me before? My mother seemed so scarred by the event that she didn't want to give me any more details, but my need for answers was too strong to leave me with that uncertainty. I decided to search for the truth. I didn't know where to start, but I had to do it. My first step was to contact the hospital where I was born. I wanted to know if there were any records, anything that could shed some light on what had happened. After several attempts, an old file finally turned up. The papers were old, yellowed by the passage of time, and didn't seem to contain much relevant information. There was only one mention that a baby had been handed over to the authorities for an alleged adoption process, but the child's name was not recorded, nor was any other information. It was as if he had been erased from existence itself. As I reviewed the documents, the feeling that I was looking for something I would never find took hold of me. Then one day, I received a call that changed everything. The voice on the other end of the line was familiar, although I couldn't place it right away. It belonged to someone who worked in the hospital administration and who apparently had access to more information than I had been shown. At first I thought it was a mistake or some kind of macabre joke, but when he explained that there was someone who wanted to see me, I was overcome with anxiety. The man who contacted me asked me to meet him in a secluded place, a small cafe on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the kind of meeting I would normally agree to, but something in his tone, in his words, made me decide to go. Something inside me felt that I was about to discover something important. The meeting took place on a rainy afternoon. Raindrops pounded the cafe windows, creating a tense atmosphere. I sat at a table in the corner, waiting. After a few minutes, a man entered. He was of average build, dressed in simple clothes, but with a serious look on his face. He recognized me immediately. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat down across from me and stared at me. He was the one who started talking, and he did so bluntly. He explained that after years of internal investigations, he had discovered that my twin brother, the missing baby, had never been adopted by a family. Instead, he had been taken by someone at the hospital who had their own interests, dark interests involving a baby trafficking ring. The truth was more twisted than I could have imagined. My brother was never part of a loving family. He was used as a commodity, an object in a corrupt system that took advantage of the vulnerabilities of the healthcare system. That day, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. My brother, that being of my own flesh and blood, had been out of my life all this time. And worst of all, it seemed that his existence had been manipulated, used by people who should never have been involved in his life. But the man didn't give me any more details. He told me I had to find my brother on my own. The information he had was fragmentary and risky, and he couldn't tell me more without putting his own life in danger. From then on, my life became a frantic search. For months I searched tirelessly, checking files, visiting places, contacting people who might have a clue. And finally, at the age of 31, I managed to find him. My twin brother was alive, but his life had been completely different from mine. He had grown up in precarious conditions in a system that denied him the right to know who he was, where he came from. We met in an awkward, strange way, like two strangers facing an uncomfortable truth, but the connection was undeniable. The same tone of voice, the same gestures, the same way of looking at the world, and yet we were two completely different people. My brother had been scarred by life in ways I couldn't understand. He had witnessed abuse, lies, a world that had treated him like an object, like a mere number. We looked at each other, but there were no words that could fill the void between us. The truth we had discovered was not what we had imagined. We had been separated not by natural circumstances, but by something much more sinister. And yet, despite everything, we didn't know how to rebuild the relationship we had never had. The only thing I knew for sure was that in the end, our story had not ended as I had hoped. I had found my brother, but the truth that bound us together was much darker than I could have imagined. The days I have left are falling apart one by one, like snow falling in winter, cold, relentless, as if time itself were slipping through my fingers. The diagnosis came as a sentence, but it wasn't a surprise. In some dark corner of my mind, I already knew. I was already expecting that moment. What did surprise me was the clarity with which everything else presented itself. The remorse, the guilt, and above all, the secret. The doctor spoke of a terminal illness, but his words seemed distant to me. What did it matter now? The truth is, I wasn't worried about death itself. Death was just the natural end of it all. What torments me is what I did, what I kept deep inside me for so many years, what I could never share with anyone. And now, in my final days, I feel that the shadow of that secret is haunting me with an intensity that even death cannot erase. Many years ago, when I was still young, I did something I never imagined I would do. At that time, the world seemed much simpler, full of opportunities and paths to follow. I was an impulsive young man, full of pride and arrogance, like many others my age. What I did was an accident, or at least that's how I saw it at the time. But over time, I realized that it had not been an accident, but a decision, and a very deliberate one at that. I lived in a small town where everyone knew each other and everyone's lives seemed within reach. In those years, life was wilder, more direct, and passions ran high. Arguments and confrontations often seemed inevitable. But nothing in my life, nothing I had experienced up to that point, prepared me for what happened that night. I remember it all starting with a fight. It wasn't personal, at least not in the way I understand it today. It was a matter of pride, of who was stronger, of who dominated whom. There was something in the air, a palpable tension, as if everyone was waiting for something to explode. And I was there, as always, waiting for something to happen, without really thinking about the consequences. The victim of that fight wasn't someone important in my life. I knew him, of course, but he wasn't a close friend. He was just another young guy from town, someone I'd had run-ins with before, but it had never amounted to anything serious. At that moment, I didn't care much who he was. All I cared about was the idea of being stronger, of not letting myself be intimidated. The fight started out trivial, like those fights that start with words and escalate into shoving. But this one was different. It was more violent, more direct. The rage I felt was not something I could control. The punches started landing harder, and something inside me, something dark, took over my mind. I couldn't stop. Every blow I landed seemed justified, as if I were fighting against everything that had been repressed in my life, as if that fight were the culmination of all my frustration, all my anger. In the end, what started as a teenage fight ended up much worse. The victim fell to the ground, and at that moment something inside me stopped. I looked at his bloodied face and realized I had killed him. In that moment, I didn't fully understand. I didn't know what I had done. I just knew that something about his face wasn't right anymore. Something had changed. And when I looked into his empty eyes, I knew I could never go back. The chaos that ensued was immediate. At first, I thought I could get away with it. No one had really seen what had happened. No one had been a direct witness to the outcome. But rumors began to spread through the town. Accusations were made. My friends looked at me differently, and the police started asking questions. I didn't know what to do. Fear took hold of me, and guilt began to gnaw at me from within, a constant pain that never allowed me to rest. What happened next was a string of lies, one after another. I denied everything. No one could know the truth. No one could understand what had happened in my mind that night. I convinced myself that it wasn't my fault, that I wasn't really responsible. After all, the boy had been drunk. It had been an accident. It had been a fight that got out of control. Those were the lies I took refuge in, the lies I built my life on for all those years. But the truth was still there, always present, always reminding me of what I had done. Every time I saw my mother's face or my wife's face, I felt like the shadow of that act covered everything. And as the years passed, I realized that the weight of silence was not only emotional, but physical. Guilt slowly consumed me, and with it, my health, my happiness, and my ability to look forward. I felt like I was falling apart inside, like life was something I could no longer sustain. My family never knew. No one knew, not even my wife. She saw a man who had had a stable life, a family he loved, a respectable job. But I wasn't that person. I wasn't the man they believed me to be. My life was a facade I had built to hide what I had done, and I couldn't let anyone know. I couldn't drag my family, my children, into the same hell I had lived in for so long. It was my burden, my cross to bear, and I would bear it alone. Now, when the doctors told me I didn't have much time left, part of me felt relief, but another part felt an urgent need to confess what I had done. Why? I don't know. Maybe it's the proximity of death that's pushing me to seek redemption, even though I know I won't find it. Maybe it's just desperation, the fear of taking the secret to the grave with me, without anyone knowing what really happened. I don't have much time left, I know. And what hurts me most is not the disease that is consuming me, but the feeling that there is nothing I can do to change what happened. The truth is trapped inside me, and when I'm gone, no one will ever know what happened that night. No one will know what I did, what I unleashed in that moment of blind rage. I just hope that somehow my children will understand that what I did was a mistake, a horror I never wanted, but that haunted me like a shadow throughout my life. Maybe they can learn from my failure. Maybe they can avoid what I couldn't, if there is any lesson to be learned from all this. The snow continues to fall outside my window, and the cold enters my room. My body is growing weaker, but my mind remains alert, tormented by the truth I could never share. Perhaps this is the last time I will think about this. Perhaps I will never remember what happened again. But when I finally close my eyes, I know that the weight of that secret will be the last thing I take with me. And as winter progresses, I feel everything fading away, everything going dark. And with it, my last breath, the last of many years of silence. My life was always simple and logical, focused on verifiable facts and daily routine. I am a man of science, accustomed to working with the tangible, with the verifiable. However, what happened to me one summer night changed my perception of reality forever. It was one of those hot, humid nights when the air seems to be suspended in a dense, invisible layer. I was driving down a back road, away from the city lights, toward a house I had recently purchased. I decided to take a detour through the countryside, looking for some peace and quiet after an exhausting week at work. The moon was almost full and the sky was clear, giving the landscape an almost magical atmosphere. However, something in the air that night was not right. My car, an old model that had never let me down, began to make a strange noise. At first, I thought it was just a vibration coming from the engine, but the sound grew louder as I drove on. I decided to pull over and check the vehicle. It was nothing serious, just a rock stuck in the exhaust system. But when I opened the car door and stepped onto the ground, the atmosphere around me changed immediately. The air was colder than I expected, and the sound of the normally quiet road had become completely muted. The buzzing of insects, the sounds of nocturnal animals, even the wind that used to rustle the tree branches, everything was gone. The stillness was overwhelming, almost oppressive. There was something in the air, something that shouldn't have been there. A glow, something that didn't correspond to the stars or the moon. It was a bright point of light, moving in a way that didn't resemble any airplane or satellite I had ever seen. It wasn't fixed in the sky. It moved erratically, at a speed that didn't correspond to any known object. I stood frozen for a few seconds, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The point of light approached rapidly, defying any notion of logic I could muster. My heart began to pound. My mind tried to rationalize what was happening, searching for a logical explanation. An airplane, a drone, some kind of experimental aircraft. But none of that fit. The light shone in a way that was impossible to ignore, and its movement was as fluid as it was erratic. It wasn't just a light moving, but a constant change in direction, almost as if it were responding to something. Suddenly, the object stopped in midair, suspended, motionless, right above my head. A beam of light, bright and warm, descended from the object toward the ground, illuminating everything around it. I felt a strange pressure in my chest, as if something were crushing me, but without pain. It was as if the atmosphere itself were charged with electricity. The air became dense, vibrating, and for a brief moment everything around me fell completely silent, even the sound of my own breathing. What happened next was the most terrifying thing of all. The object began to move again, but this time, it wasn't moving erratically. It was moving in an orderly fashion toward the horizon, as if it were following a pattern. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It was as if the object was in complete control of its movements, changing direction in a way that defied all logic. After a few minutes, the object slowly faded away until it became a small light that disappeared into the distance. The pressure in the air disappeared immediately, and the silence that had reigned was transformed back into the normal sounds of the night. I stood there motionless for what seemed like an eternity. My body was shaking, not only from fear, but from the discomfort of what I had just witnessed. I couldn't believe what had happened. My mind tried desperately to rationalize what I had experienced, but I couldn't find a logical explanation. There were no signs of planes, no noise, no visible technology that could have caused what I saw. All I knew was that I had seen it, and that terrified me. After several minutes of being in shock, I got back in the car and started the engine. I couldn't stay there. With trembling hands, I grabbed the steering wheel and drove away quickly, without looking back, with the feeling that something had changed in the air and the world, something I could no longer understand. Days passed and thoughts about what had happened wouldn't leave me alone. I tried to talk to some people, but when I described what I had seen, the reactions were always the same: disbelief, confusion, and in some cases, nervous laughter. No one could take me seriously. After all, who would be willing to believe such an absurd story? I felt alone with my experience, isolated in a world that couldn't understand what had happened. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an experimental plane or some kind of secret aircraft, but the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that there was no logical explanation that fit. How could an object move so erratically, so precisely, and so silently? And how could it disappear without a trace? No. What I had seen was something completely out of the ordinary, something that went beyond any known technology, and that reality was far more terrifying than any other explanation. What disturbed me most was the persistent feeling that the object had known I was there, that it had observed me before moving away. There was something about its movement that suggested an intelligence behind it, something that could not be explained by conventional physics alone. I felt watched, as if I had been part of something bigger, something I did not understand. Sometimes in the stillness of the night, when the wind blew softly and the city lights twinkled in the distance, the memory of that encounter would come flooding back. The pressure in the air, the feeling of being watched, the light descending toward the ground. It all became more vivid every time I thought about it. I tried to get on with my life. I tried to forget about it, to get on with my work, to act as if nothing had happened, but the memory lingered. And most disconcertingly, strange things began to happen. They weren't major events, but they were enough to unsettle me. Sometimes I felt something moving in the shadows and the air around me seemed heavier than normal. There were nights when I would wake up with a start, feeling like something was watching me, like something was lurking. I thought maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, that fear and anxiety had begun to affect me. But more and more I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else, something I didn't yet understand. Several weeks passed before I finally decided to investigate. I went to the area where I had had the encounter, hoping to find some clue, something that could explain what had happened. When I arrived, the landscape looked normal, like any other field away from the city. However, as I approached the exact spot where I had stopped my car, I noticed something strange. The ground was covered with a strange mark, a footprint that did not correspond to any animal or human footprint. It was as if the ground itself had been affected by an unknown pressure, as if something had been suspended in the air, right above that spot, before disappearing. At that moment, I knew that what I had experienced was not an illusion, not a figment of my imagination. What I had seen that night was real, and the truth is, that certainty terrified me more than anything else, because if that was real, if that was happening, what else was out there that I couldn't see? What other things beyond my understanding existed in the shadows waiting to be discovered? I have never returned to that area since, nor have I spoken to anyone else about it. I prefer not to know more. I prefer to live with the doubt, with the uncertainty, than to face a reality I cannot comprehend. All I know is that something was watching me that night, and worst of all, it seems to still be watching me.